I'll be reading Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 13 from the New International Version of the Bible. This passage will be about love in action. Love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, never lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor. Serving the Lord, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality.
Amen. Thank you, Zach. This is going to be the last lesson in a series that I've been doing with you on Sunday mornings. Next week, for 3 weeks, I'm going to begin a new series that I'm titling God With Us. I've got a really neat opportunity coming up in November. I've been invited to speak at a conference for teens up in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And this is the theme that they picked out. And they've asked me to do 3 lessons that are going to provide kind of an overarching theme. And then they're going to have breakout classes where people kind of explore some of the smaller topics. So I wanted to take the opportunity just to work through some of these ideas, somewhat in preparation for that. But I hope these will be some ideas that you find helpful. So this is coming up starting next week. We're going to be doing that. But for today, we're going to be doing the last lesson in this series that we've called God is Greater. God is greater than our ups and our downs, our highs and our lows. He's the one that we can turn to in all situations. And as we've explored this idea, we've talked about the way that understanding the greatness of God really does lead us to a place of humility. There's a story that I came across, and it's one of those stories it's a historical story, and I don't know how much we could verify the history of it, but I still think the truth revealed by it is one that's worth thinking about. But it's a story about a man who was riding on a horse. And as he was traveling through a pretty difficult road, he came to a place in the road where there was an enormous log in the road that was blocking the way. And there was a group of soldiers who were there working on trying to move this log. And there was a corporal who was watching these soldiers sitting there on his horse. And he was watching them work, and he wasn't going to get off and help them. So the soldiers are over there with their backs bent over, and they're straining and they're grunting, and they just can't quite get this log to move. And so the man on the horse went over to the corporal and said, "Well, are you just going to let them do that?" And he said, "I'm the corporal. I give orders." And he wasn't going to lift a finger. And so the man on the horse got off of the horse. He went over and he helped them. And with that one extra hand, that one extra person, they were able to successfully move that log out of the way. And then as the rider went to get back onto his horse, he turned and said to the corporal, "The next time your men need help, send for the commander-in-chief." Now, it turns out the person who did this was George Washington. But he had seen a need, and where he saw the need, it was frustrating to him to see someone who could have helped and chose not to help and chose to view themselves as being above having to do that kind of work. But he was known as being a humble person. There's something really respectable about being a person of humility. A person who doesn't always insist on being called by a certain title or treated in a certain way or expect to be treated different or better somehow than everyone else. And so I want to walk us through once again. We've had 8 different parts we've talked about in this path that moves us towards humility. I want to run through them very quickly. We began by talking about the importance of allowing God to be God. He's the only God. He's the only one who deserves to sit in the throne of our life. We need to allow Him to be God. And if we do this, we should also trust that God's will is even better than my own will. Even though I have some plans for myself and some things I'd like to do, I trust that God knows what I need even more than I know what I need for myself. Now, inevitably, life is going to get difficult. But it's important that we don't give up just because life is difficult, because through our hard circumstances, God can be at work in shaping us through both the good and the bad, helping us to become the people that He's making us into. Now, inevitably, we're going to falter and we're going to stumble. And when we do this, there's great healing that's found in confession and in prayer, just to get it off of our chest that, I really want to be a better person than I am, but this is all that I am. And so just to turn that over to a person that we trust, to pray for each other, there's great healing found in that. And the more we learn to trust in God, the more we discover that we really do already have what we need. We are enough with what God has given us. In doing this, we can purify our speech. We can hold back on a lot of the negative things that we'd be tempted to say because we're not combating with other human beings. We're a child of God, and we can find contentment in that. We've talked about striving only for God's approval in all things. And then last week we talked about trying to say what is really worth saying. As a Christian, there are certain things that we should articulate and verbalize. And so we've walked through all these steps, and the one that we get to today is the importance of learning to honor each other above ourselves. Learning to honor one another above ourselves. Not just that we would stop fighting and arguing, not that just that we would restrain ourselves, but that we would be active in trying to bring honor to others around us. We really want to become humility. It's a word. Humility is a word, it's a virtue, it's an action, but it's not enough just to think about humility. We want to become humility. When you read the Gospel of John, the first chapter of John, there's a lot of interesting philosophical stuff that's going on as John is talking about Jesus as the Word. But to me, one of the most helpful concepts in Scripture, when I think about what it means to be a Christian, certainly what it means to be a minister, he says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. There's all these things. What does it mean by the Word? I mean, there's this concept of the Word, this embodied wisdom. There's all the things we could say about God, but something about Jesus, when Jesus took all those words we could say about God and he put skin and bones on them, and then he lived as that Word. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's like learning to swim. You can read every textbook in the world on swimming, but the only way to learn how to swim is actually to get in the water and to do it. Jesus was the Word who became flesh. Our challenge is to try and become humility for those around us in such a way that even though they could talk about what it means to be humble, you want someone to be able to look at your life and point to you and say, see, that's a person who practices humility. That's a person who doesn't esteem themselves more highly than they ought. That's a person who doesn't seek their own best in every situation, but really a lot of the time deserves more credit than we give them. Just the way that Jesus was the Word who became flesh, we want to become humility for the lives of the people around us so they can understand what it means by looking at us. I would point to the Apostle Paul as a great example of humility in action, someone who really became humble because of his walk of faith. Paul had all sorts of academic credentials. He had excellent training in his religious heritage. He was schooled and mentored by some of the very best. Paul had every reason to brag about his credentials. He's also a Roman citizen. He had higher standing than some of his Jewish brothers and sisters would have. But when you look at the way Paul uses his earthly credentials, you never see Paul do it in a purely selfish way, at least not after the time that he became a Christian. Whenever you see Paul start defending his academic credentials, for example, it's in a situation where someone is trying to belittle the gospel that he's preaching, and they're trying to tout their own intelligence and their own importance. And Paul will say, well, hold on. Now, I've got all those things too, but that's not really what matters. What matters is Jesus Christ and what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. He uses his credentials only as a way to help further the gospel. His Roman citizenship, he never makes an issue of it until there's an opportunity in Acts where being a Roman citizen would help to further the cause of the gospel. He views everything else as rubbish in comparison to knowing Jesus Christ and walking with Jesus Christ. And as a person of humility, part of what makes him a person of humility is this great consistency that he has in his character. Wherever you see Paul going, you find the same person doing the same kinds of things. We think before his death, Paul had an opportunity to make his appeal even to Caesar himself. We see Paul talk to governors. At the gathering at Mars Hill at the Areopagus, we see Paul getting together with a lot of the thought leaders of the day who loved to just get together and talk about the latest ideas. In any one of those settings, he was quite worthy to have a hearing, and he wasn't shy about speaking up for the cause of Christ. When he had opportunity to talk to a person of high power and high standing, he made every effort to convert that person. He wanted to actively share his faith when he had impressive speaking opportunities or hearings with important people. But the amazing thing about Paul is that it didn't depend on him being in that circumstance that made him willing to share about Christ in those ways. Because you can think about Paul in places that you'd much rather not be. Paul and Silas in prison. What was he doing when he was in prison? He and Silas are singing songs, and then when they had opportunity, when there was that earthquake and they could have escaped, rather than escaping, he chose to stay there and to preach to the jailer. Ended up baptizing him and his whole household. The same thing is true about the times that Paul was in prison. So many of the letters that we have in the New Testament, a lot of the writings that we have are simply because while Paul was in prison, he said, well, if I can't go out and teach there, I'll just write letters from in here. And he continued teaching. He continued being the same person. Just the same as when he was being transported while he was in prison. He was transported, he was shipwrecked, he went through all these bizarre situations, but in every situation, because he knew who he was as a Christian, he knew what God's place was in his life and what his responsibilities were to God, he simply went about continuing to be that same person that he was supposed to be. Humility is key to the Christian walk because no one can undermine a humble person's confidence in God. I want to say that again. Humility is key to the Christian walk because no one can undermine a humble person's confidence in God. Once you've got it at a core level that you know who you are as God's child, that you take all that stuff in Romans 8 seriously, that there is nothing that can separate you from the love of God, and there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. If you let that sink down really deeply in your life and you hang on to it, you have what Paul had. You can be content in every situation. He could say things like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I know that I can endure this too because I know the solid foundation that I'm standing on. We find the strength that we need as a humble person whose confidence is in God that no one is able to just take away from us. They can't push you around. They can't force you to violate your own conscience. You can simply keep living out of that faith in any circumstance. A goal for us as we talk about all these different practices of being a humble person is that we want to see our habits become our natural response. The more you make a habit of being a certain way, the more you make a habit with your actions of doing things a certain way, eventually that just becomes your gut reaction in any situation. So our habits become our natural response. If you make prayer such a regular part of your day and a regular part of your life, and you try as hard as you can to make your first response always be to pray with people and for people, then when something gets difficult, pretty obviously praying might be one of the first things that you do. If you train your heart every day that rather than focusing on the negatives and the things you don't like, you're going to focus on the good things that you do have, you're going to focus on your blessings, you're going to focus on the good things in others, why over time you do train your heart in such a way that you can be a person who thinks positively, who sees the good in other people. If you continue to fill your head with Scripture, your inner thoughts will sound a lot like God's own words. If you're always feeding Scripture into your head, you do become what you consume, and your thoughts can become much more like God's thoughts. Consistency comes from being deliberate, not just from reacting to things. This morning, I wanted to walk us through one of my very favorite passages in Scripture. It's the one that Zachary read for us a few moments ago from Romans chapter 12, verses 9 to 13. And I really like, especially down to verse 19, but I'm gonna limit myself just to a shorter passage today as we talk about this. But if you're thinking about your Christian walk and trying to figure out how it is that you should grow, I would encourage you to take this little passage and treat it as a to-do list. You really can't go wrong by trying to embody these things that Paul puts forth here in Romans 12. Every one of these things is healthy, and if we did it more, we would be a better Christian. He begins by saying, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. If we're going to be people characterized by love, we've got to make every effort we can to allow our love to be something that's coming from a real and sincere place. We don't want our love to be false. We want our love to be real. And he says we want to hate what is evil and cling to what is good. Talking about what you love and what you hate is really a conversation about your priorities. What is it in your life that you're going to decide you just simply don't have time for? That because I'm clinging on to Christ, because I'm clinging on to love, I don't have time to hang on to bitterness so much. I don't have time to hang on to dishonesty. I don't have time or room in my life to cling to some of those negative things because God has given me something positive to cling to. I'm reminded of 1 John chapter 4 and verse 18 where John says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. John reminds us that if we're people who claim to be Christian and yet we constantly feel in fear of the world around us, that we don't have enough or we're not good enough or we're going to fail or what failure would mean about what people think about us, if we're constantly living in this fear of the world around us, he says our hearts have not yet been perfected by the power of love. Understanding the love of God and receiving the love of God gives us a groundedness that helps us to endure every situation. Experiencing the perfect love of God drives out fear. And the more we cling to it, the more we can let go of and despise those things that are evil, those things that go against God, those things that drag us down. Love must be sincere, he says. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. He says in verse 10, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Notice he doesn't say, be acquainted with one another in love. He says, be devoted, not just acquainted, but devoted to one another in brotherly love. It's an easy temptation for us to be walking around all the time and kind of asking, what has the church done for me lately? One of the big problems in our culture, especially in an affluent culture, is that we kind of expect the world to bend to our expectations. So to even be able to use a term like church shopping, that's not a privilege that the church has enjoyed in many centuries. But when all we think about is, what is it that the church has done for me? What are the people doing for me? And I'm going to sit back and wait until someone does that thing I wish they would do. We're asking the wrong question. We need to be asking the question, if I'm really devoted to these people here in brotherly love, if I'm really devoted to them, what would that devotion drive me to do? Not what has the church done for me lately, but what have I done lately for the people in my church? How have I been reaching out to someone who needs more love and more attention? What have I done to make sure that someone else who's working hard receives the honor that they deserve? If each of us makes that our goal, then sooner or later it does work itself around, doesn't it? If each of us would just make it our goal to bring honor and encouragement to the people around us, that has a way of coming back to us, doesn't it? It says, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves. And in verse 11, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. I'm going to be really blunt with you. I've been in ministry since 2004, so I'm in, I guess, about 14 years of ministry. I'm going to tell you, if you're involved in a church, there is no time to be bored. If you're really committed to your life at church, if you're committed to God, I'm going to tell you, I have the privilege of working in ministry. I say this genuinely, I can't remember what it feels like to be bored. There are so many things that need to get done. And if you're not sure what to do, or if you're feeling bored in your faith, it means that you need to do something. I would encourage you just to grab that bulletin and look at it. There's probably some class somewhere you could be a part of. There's some need that you could be meeting. There's a person who's shut in right now who's not getting a lot of attention, who would love to hear from you. There's people that you could be praying for. And if you don't see the thing that you feel is on your heart, you have an opportunity to step up and help make us better. When you see a need and there's a hole there and you're saying someone should do something about that, why shouldn't that be you? If you have the passion for it and the wisdom of what needs to be done, look for ways that you can step up. Don't be lacking in zeal. Some translations would say slothful in zeal. Don't be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord, not just when you're asked to do it, but because you see an opportunity and you can do it. So I say, not meaning to be mean-spirited, I don't get how any Christian could ever say that they're bored. There's just too much good to be done that we can all be part of. Never be lacking in zeal. He says in verse 12, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. This verse has a special importance to me because I think about this 14-year-old boy that was in my youth group in Nashville. He himself had experienced some significant health problems and almost died as a young child. And in fact, one of his lungs still, doesn't work at all. He has one lung that's basically just dead tissue. He has a younger sister who used to be the healthier one, but over time she developed some kind of a youthful, juvenile form of arthritis, a really bad type. And for her to be able to walk and move around at all, she had to take chemotherapy. But of course, as you know, chemotherapy is not really great for you either. So she had this option of, do I feel kind of sick all the time because I'm on chemo, or do I have to stay confined to a wheelchair because I can't walk? We were doing a devotional at a retreat, and we were talking about some of our favorite Bible verses. And this young man told me this was his favorite Bible verse that he tried to live his life by. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. He said, when I'm not sure what to do, these are the things I continue trying to do. Those 3 words describe so much of what we should be like as Christians. Joyful, patient, and faithful. Joyful, positive, optimistic, trying to look for the blessing, trying to look for the better side of things. Patient, I'm willing to wait. I'm willing to give you room to grow. I don't insist on getting my own way in every circumstance. And then faithful, I'm just not willing to give up. It's a powerful, very small verse. Paul continues in verse 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. You know, it's so important for us as a church to always be people trying to practice hospitality. Some of the most important words you can ever utter are when you see a person who might be newer or someone that you don't know and you use those 3 words, you come too. We're going to go to lunch after church. Why don't you come too? We've got something going on later this week in my class. Why don't you come too? Practicing hospitality, looking for ways to make space for others. We want to always be communicating very clearly with our words and our actions that you are welcome in my family, you are welcome in my life, and certainly you are welcome in our church. And church, if you don't tell that to people, how are they going to know it? We have to communicate that to each other. So we spent several weeks talking about the value of humility, and I'm going to try and kind of fit it all in a nutshell here as I conclude things. Humility is something that liberates us. Humility is something that frees us. We don't need merely to think about humility. We want to become humility. We need to honor one another above ourselves. We need to serve with zeal and with energy. And when we live out of humility, giving God everything that we can, valuing each other the way that God has valued us, we experience this greater form of freedom. Self-control is something that you could align very closely with humility, and self-control is something that's key to spiritual growth. It's hard to be a humble person without having self-control. Self-control means being aware of where I am at the moment, who I am at the moment, what I'm being like at the moment, and paying attention to what kind of effect my presence and my actions and my words are having. But being a person of self-control helps us live as the best possible version of ourselves. Because when we're unbalanced, doesn't imbalance affect every part of our life? If you're living a life without balance, without thought about what you're doing, by default, we're going to get off kilter. And when that happens in one area of your life, it starts affecting all the other areas of your life. If you're off kilter in how much time you're spending on your occupation to the neglect of your family, that has negative consequences. If all you do is worry about your family without worrying about staying connected to church or staying connected to your career, there's negative effects that can have. But everything needs to be held in balance. Self-control, humility, is something that helps us maintain that balance. Secondly, learning to have a respect for others opens up the wisdom of the world for me and for you. When I look at other people around me and I take a posture of humility and say, that's a person who was made in the image of God, and even if right now I feel like that person, what that really means is I need to get closer to that person because there's something redemptive about them. There's some way I could be better if we were connected as opposed to what happens when we're separate from each other. But when I take a posture of humility and I'm open to the world, there's so many great things that I can learn. There's so many great things that we can experience, all the different talents and skills and hobbies and new ways of looking at things. It's all such a gift that God has given us in this community of faith if we're willing to open and receive that gift of Christian fellowship. Respect for others opens the world up to each of us. And finally, humility helps us to be free from self-deception. To be a person that's not humble is to be a person who says, I don't really need your help, I've already got it together. God has a way of correcting people who think that way, doesn't he? If I try to tell myself that I've just got it all together and I don't need any help and I'm already good enough and I already know enough and I've already done enough, no one's ever correct when they think in those ways. Believing that I haven't reached my peak yet, believing that I could still grow, believing that I haven't done all that I can do yet, it means that we've got room to keep growing. I wanted to share one story with you that I think is a great encapsulation of what it looks like to be a humble person. And you may have heard this one before. It's a story about a man who was called the Keeper of the Springs. This is a man who lived up high above an Austrian village along the eastern slope of the Alps. And his job was, from the time he was a very young man, they hired him to clear out debris from some of the naturally occurring bodies of water, some little pools and streams that would flow down close to the town. And so as a very young man, he was given this job and a meager salary. He lived up high above the town in the mountains, far away from most people, or occasionally he would just come to town for things that he needed. And his simple role was to go about quietly, clearing out the pollution, clearing out the dirt, clearing out the other things that would make that water get dirty. And therefore, everyone in town enjoyed a beautiful setting. The town had frequent visitors, frequent tourists, and at some point in time, the people got together and had this town council meeting. And someone noticed this guy who was now an old man. They noticed his salary in the town's budget and said, "Why are we paying this guy? Why are we spending that much money to give this guy a salary? I haven't seen him. I don't know this guy. Do you know this guy?" So by unanimous vote, they decided to cut the guy's salary and to tell him they didn't need his services anymore. It wasn't too long before the autumn leaves started falling. Branches started falling into the water. The water went from being a clear color to starting to become more of a dirty, yellowish color. There was film and algae that started growing on the surface of the water. Before too long, there were foul odors that started. The mill wheels started slowing down. The swans started leaving, and before long, the tourists stopped coming. They started getting weird kinds of sicknesses and diseases that they hadn't had trouble with before coming from the water. And so it wasn't too long until, very embarrassed, the town council had another meeting, and kind of groveling, they went back to the old man, the Keeper of the Springs, and asked him if he would please, once again, do those good things that he was doing, and were happy to reinstate his salary because they saw there was value in that. You know, being a humble person means a lot of times that people may not notice everything that you're doing. But we are so grateful for the Keepers of the Springs that we have here among us. The people who serve faithfully, who serve quietly, not because they want attention, not because they want accolades, but what a great benefit we'll receive from those people who are willing to be zealous, humble servants who simply go about doing good. It makes all of us better, and often it's not until someone is missing or something is gone that we realize how valuable that service is. My challenge for each of us is to be like that Keeper of the Springs. There are things that you see, opportunities that you know about that maybe the rest of us would be blind to. But when you see those opportunities, would you make the most of them? Would you invite that person you know who might be thinking about searching for Christ? Would you step up and serve where that need is that you know you're capable of serving? As you think about your life this morning, this is a time for all of us to reflect. And if there's something that you need to commit to doing this morning, you might just want to do that quietly as you stand there and pray where you are. You might want to come forward and allow some of our elders to pray over you. Or maybe this morning you'd like to commit your life to Christ. You'd like to submit to Him in baptism and turn everything over to Him and start fresh. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is a time you can respond if you need. We invite you to come as together we stand and sing.